I have a Google Doc linked below that documents the gameplay information of each bonus playable character I've covered in this series. If something is incorrect or missing, please post a reply to my pinned comment so I can update the Google Doc. Welcome back to part 2 of this bonus playable character series focusing on the Igavania games, meaning the Castlevania games that strongly follow Koji Igarashi's Symphony of the Night. In part 1 I covered all versions of Symphony of the Night and Bloodstained Ritual of the Night. Now in part 2 I'll cover the Castlevania trilogy on the Game Boy Advance, which features my all-time favorite Castlevania game, so I'm pretty pumped. And then finally part 3 will cover the DS trilogy. Part 1 has a more detailed introduction if you want, otherwise let's just jump right in. Castlevania Circle of the Moon doesn't actually have any bonus playable characters, so I guess we can move on then.
Not so fast!
I think Circle of the Moon still merits a quick look. Developed as a Game Boy Advance launch title, Circle of the Moon was the first Castlevania game to attempt following in Symphony of the Night's Metroidvania-styled footsteps. However, Koji Igarashi was not directly involved, probably busy with Castlevania Chronicles. Circle's story distances itself from the Belmont clan, instead starring Nathan Graves, who, alongside his master Morris Baldwin and Morris's son Hugh, travel to an old castle to attempt to stop Camilla from reviving Dracula. But they're too late and quickly get separated from each other, forcing Nathan to work through the castle alone to find and defeat Dracula. Nathan feels a lot like a classic Belmont character. Taking more inspiration from Richter than Alucard, Nathan has a whip attack, a slide, and slow, stiff movements, at least until unlocking his run early in the quest. His movements are a little awkward with the double tap run and the jump that shoots up higher than you might expect. His moveset doesn't really fill out very much. He gets a couple standard upgrades like a double jump and high jump, and some questionable ones like a tackle, wall jump, and the ability to push boxes, and that's pretty much it. He does have the DSS, but I'll explain that later. With Nathan's limited and at times clunky moveset, Circle of the Moon isn't my favorite game of the Igavanias to play, but it is a solid Metroidvania that I consider worth playing if exploring and leveling up are up your alley, especially if you're looking for Metroidvania with a healthy dose of challenge. In lieu of any bonus playable characters, Circle's unlockable alternate modes all feature Nathan but with modified stats, sort of like Alucard's luck mode but more distinct. For instance, the first of these is Magician Mode, which grants Nathan high MP and intelligence, but lowers his HP, strength, and defense. Additionally, he gets access to all 20 cards in the DSS, which stands for Dual Setup System. The way this works is Nathan gains access to a special ability by combining 1 of 10 action cards and 1 of 10 attribute cards, leading to a total of 100 abilities to choose from. These range from granting elemental attributes to the whip, increasing a base stat, changing the whip to another weapon, summoning a familiar, summoning one of the attribute card creatures for a screen nuke, or even more random effects like boosting speed, increasing experience, or casting an item crash. However, there are some problems with the DSS. In the standard game mode, to use a card it must first be found, usually through random enemy drops, so by the end of the game you'll likely own maybe half of the cards if you're lucky, and there's no guarantee you'll stumble upon a combo with a useful ability. If you're replaying the game and there's a combo you really like, you have to hope for a fortuitous drop or else grind enemies until you find your card. If you're unsatisfied with your combos or just want to know what the other options are, you're basically required to use a guide so you can see what enemies drop what card and what combos do what. In Magician Mode, you start with all 20 cards, so you don't have to worry about finding them, which is a cool idea. But even then, figuring out what each combo does is unintuitive. First you have to pause to equip the card combo, then you have to press L to activate the spell, and then you have to do something so the spell actually takes effect and the ability gets listed in the menu, and you can only equip a single ability at a time. So that's 100 different combos you have to test, and a few of them require getting hit by a certain elemental attack to activate, or require a special button combo that you wouldn't know unless you looked it up. So the DSS on display in Magician Mode shows its flaws unless you're really knowledgeable about the game already. There are good abilities in there, but all the time I spent on the wiki trying to find the best ones really soured my experience, especially when you're constantly dying due to low HP and defense. Fighter Mode comes next, and as you may expect, it lowers MP and intelligence, but increases HP, strength, and defense. The other caveat is it removes all access to the DSS. This actually makes it feel a lot like normal mode, just with more power, which is really helpful, probably more so than the entire DSS. Honestly, after mowing through hordes of enemies, you can stroll up to bosses under-leveled, tank multiple hits and smack them around for a while, and gain 2 level ups for your trouble. This is the game's power fantasy mode. You really are like a hot knife through butter. Losing access to handy card combos like the Thunderbird summon sounds bad on paper, but you'll be plowing through the game so fast you won't even miss it. This is definitely my favorite of Circle's alternate modes. The last interesting mode is the shooter mode. Nathan's HP, strength, and defense are lowered again, but his max hearts are boosted to encourage using sub-weapons, all of which do increased damage. They become your main means of attack, and some even cost less hearts. He even gains access to a new one, the homing knife, by grabbing a second knife. It's a little less powerful than the regular knife, but the convenience of the homing functionality encouraged me to hold on to it over the other sub-weapons. And the boost in heart capacity really made a difference. I was using sub-weapons pretty liberally and I never even got close to running out. This simple buff to sub-weapons is pretty unique, and this mode was far more interesting than I expected. And finally, we have Thief Mode, which is the same idea as Alucard's Luck Mode, with a drastically increased luck stat, and the rest, besides max hearts and intelligence, are reduced, though not as severely as for Alucard. It was actually kind of ridiculous seeing how often items dropped compared to the other modes, but also showed how useless a lot of the drops are during the course of the game, especially since you can't sell your extra equipment. Basically, you see what rare and useful items drop and survive as long as you can with that. Not something I'm clamoring to play. Unfortunately, these alternate modes aren't all freely available to try out after beating the game once. No, they must be unlocked sequentially by completing the previous mode. For instance, beating the game on normal only unlocks Magician Mode, and only when you beat that can you play Fighter Mode, and so on. That means playing through the game multiple times, but since you find the same magic items in the same order, the sequence in every playthrough is exactly the same each time. I can recommend playing through Circle the Moon once if you're a big Castlevania or Metroidvania fan, but only those who are really gung-ho about Circle are going to stick it out and unlock each of these alternate modes. Released a little over a year later, Castlevania Harmony of Dissonance saw Igarashi return as producer and scenario writer. His intention was to create a game that was a worthy follow-up to Symphony of the Night, and correct some of the issues he saw in Circle of the Moon. The most obvious aspect right away is the color. Circle of the Moon was frequently criticized for its dark palettes that were difficult to see on the original Game Boy Advance screen, which had no backlight. Harmony of Dissonance tried to address this by brightening everything up, and giving the playable characters like Juiced an outline for increased visibility. While I quite like the art direction and the almost psychedelic feel it gives the game, I know others find it garish. So much so that Janata Guitar and Sorrow created a recolor mod that adjusts the colors to a darker nighttime feel. I find the colors too dark for my tastes, so I instead went with Asaki's No Glow mod, which simply removes the character outlines. I used that for the rest of the footage. Igarashi brought the Belmont clan back into focus, putting Juiced Belmont in the starring role. His childhood friend Maxim returns from a 2-year training expedition with news that their other friend, Lighty, has been captured. Maxim leads Juiced to the site of her disappearance where they find a castle. As Juiced searches for Lighty, it becomes apparent that the castle is actually a manifestation of Maxim's soul. Maxim has been corrupted by Dracula's remains, his soul split into 2, resulting in 2 parallel castles that Juiced must travel between and unravel their mysteries to save Lighty and Maxim. Okay, I think it's time for me to come clean. Harmony of Dissonance is my favorite Castlevania game. I love that Juiced can dash in either direction without any cooldown, meaning he can just zoom through rooms, possibly throwing in a slide to kill a minor enemy. I love the expanded hitbox of the whip, with more of the wind-up damaging enemies. I love holding onto the holy water due to how overpowered it is. I love that the game is open enough that you can find your way into difficult areas early on. I love the soundtrack, even though it uses mainly 8-bit instruments, allegedly to save space and processing power for the visuals, and the compositions use a lot of dissonance. I mean, it's right in the title. I love the lack of any drop-dependent system, like the DSS or what we'll see in Aria of Sorrow. And I love playing as this game's bonus playable character, Maxim. You unlock Maxim Mode by beating the game. His default attack is a flurry of strikes with his stellar sword, faster but a little shorter than Juiced's whip. He also has a little kicking attack when you hold down. His sub-weapon is to throw his stellar sword in open form like a shuriken. With the right placement, it can hit enemies 2 or 3 times. Maxim can dash and slide just like Juiced, but his slide is longer and he runs much faster as well. If you thought Juiced could zip around, get a load of Maxim. He has a triple jump along with a dive kick, but no high jump. To compensate, he can gain altitude with his somersault, which behaves like Samus's screw attack but with more horizontal momentum. It does cost MP though, so keep an eye on that. He also has 2 special abilities activated by button combos, but I found them way less finicky to pull off than those of either Richter or Maria. His double spirit is a screen nuke, dealing tons of damage. It costs 100 MP, so you'll probably be able to cast it twice during a boss battle, which is more than enough. And then his healing is self-explanatory. For 50 hearts, you recover to full health. Maxim doesn't gain experience, so he's the same in the beginning and end of the journey. The only exception is that he can find life max ups to increase his HP, essentially allowing him to tank a couple extra hits, and heart max ups, allowing for more healing spells, especially useful while exploring the castles. It's also worth noting that enemies have been rebalanced to accommodate Maxim's lack of leveling. Most go down after 1 to 3 hits and deal roughly the same amount of damage. And you do have to explore the castles because your goal here is to kill all the bosses to gain access to the final boss. Since you don't gain XP, traveling through the castles is more about avoiding enemies unless you need to kill them to get them out of your way. This is where the somersault comes in handy. You're invulnerable while spinning, so in a series of straight hallways you somersault through everything. But in these more windy areas, you have to slow down a bit to navigate the platforms, all the while recovering MP. Then in the next hallway, rinse and repeat. It's almost laughable just how quickly Maxim can cut through the game, but you do have to exercise some caution since he can't take many hits before dying. The trickiest part of his mode is surviving from one save point to the next. Maxim is my favorite BPC of the Igavania games. Yes, he's overpowered, but that's part of why I like it so much. It's fun to ricochet around the castle as a badass ninja, slicing through anything that stands in your way. And he's so speedy, I don't think any of the other characters can keep pace with him. He's too fast, and he's too powerful, and that's why I love Maxim Mode. Harmony of Dissonance also has a boss rush mode. You play through one of 3 difficulties as Juiced by default, but you can play as Maxim by holding L and R while selecting a difficulty. And you can play as Simon Belmont by inputting the Konami code at the Konami logo. He plays similarly to how he does in the original Castlevania, and seems to be the most powerful of the 3 characters, so that's cool. Boss rush mode isn't really my thing though. There's also a no magic mode where Juice is restricted from using the spellbooks, which is pretty much how I play already, so... And there's a hard mode where Juice takes double damage, so that's an option if the game really is too easy for you. Developed concurrently with Harmony and released less than a year later, Castlevania Aria of Sorrow is the final entry in our trilogy, and many would argue the best. Of course, I've already shown my hand with Harmony, so you know I don't completely agree with that sentiment, but the game certainly earned its reception. Igarashi wanted to break conventions with the story, setting the game in the year 2035 during a solar eclipse. Soma Cruz and his friend Mina are drawn into Dracula's castle, which is contained in the eclipse. There, Soma meets Genya Arikado, Alucard, who tells him he must make his way to the Master's chamber so he and Mina can escape. While exploring the castle, Soma meets allies Yoko Belnades, an amnesiac Julius Belmont, and Hammer, as well as Graham, who expects to inherit Dracula's powers and become the new Dark Lord. You learn that in 1999, Julius defeated Dracula once and for all, but it was prophesied that his successor would ascend during the solar eclipse of 2035. Graham, claiming he was born the minute Dracula was defeated, assumes he is the reincarnation of Dracula's power. The only problem being Soma's power of dominance, allowing him to absorb monsters' souls and utilize their power, making him Dracula's reincarnation and leading to some shenanigans. This deviation of story conventions is really refreshing and is one of Aria's greatest strengths. But I did say I like Harmony better, so I suppose I should probably explain myself, seeing as Aria is regarded as one of the all-time best handheld games. I don't disagree there, this is a fantastic game. I just have a couple of nitpicks that were really noticeable playing Aria so soon after Harmony. Soma controls well. His jump is the most natural we've seen on the GBA, and his movements are all fluid. My hang up is that he's so slow, especially after dashing around with Juiced. Soma can't dash, and his back dash was heavily nerfed, so it's only useful in combat, so his default walk is your best option. To be clear, you will get used to Soma's pacing, it just lags far behind Juiced's. Soma can equip a slew of weapon types, more so even than Alucard. I just don't really like most of them. Short ranges, long windups or recoveries, or awkward hitboxes means equipping your most powerful weapon might be detrimental. Actually, my preference is to stick to a single weapon like Nathan or Juiced, so you become a master at it by the end of the game. To be fair, you can certainly stick with a weapon type you prefer, like swords, and just use those. That's what I did. And finally, the tactical soul system works well enough, but in my most recent playthrough, the bullet souls, which replace sub-weapons, were giving me grief. I'm not the type of guy to sit and grind enemies for soul drops, just like I didn't want to grind enemies for card drops in Circle of the Moon. So the bullet souls I had acquired in the early game really made me wish I just had the sub-weapons. For instance, when fighting the Valkyries, or the third phase of the Headhunter boss, I really wanted the axe so I could hit them from below. However, the closest thing I had was the bone throw from the skeleton, and it did minimal damage and wasn't worth the hearts. But the axe would have been perfect. I suppose you're bound to find a reliable bullet soul eventually, but that time spent without one really makes Soma feel limited. Just remember, my complaints might sound major, but all they really amount to are nitpicks. This is definitely a game you should try out, and it comes with a bonus playable character. Julius Belmont serves as the game's BPC, unlocked via the good ending. His regular attack is to whip the vampire killer, which he can swing around as well, though it isn't too useful. He also has access to the axe, cross, holy water, and Grand Cross sub-weapons, and can cycle through them at will, so no more hunting for the right one for a certain boss. See, the axe was useful for the headhunter. Julius can slide, but he can't backdash. Instead, using an ability called the Omnia Vanitas, where he phases through enemies and projectiles. Pretty situational, like for some of the harder bosses near the end. He has a double jump and comet kick attack, and uses an uppercut for his high jump. All these movements, including his walking speed, are faster than Soma's, quickening the pace, so controlling Julius is pretty enjoyable. He's certainly not as versatile or overpowered as many of the other BPCs, almost like he was really only designed to take down bosses. That leads me to the problem with Julius Mode. He doesn't gain experience, similar to the BPCs that came before, but since Aria doesn't have life vessels, mind vessels, or the like, there's nothing for Julius to hunt down while exploring the castle. The only power-ups he gets are boosts in strength, constitution, and intelligence by grabbing the boss orbs, meaning the only thing you're searching for in Julius Mode, besides save points and teleports, are bosses. Everything else can be ignored. Once you've defeated an area's boss, you can hightail it out of there and never look back. So much of the castle can be skipped, it honestly feels like a waste of an otherwise fun character. I still think Julius Mode is worth a try, but the exploration component is severely neutered. Aria of Sorrow has its own boss rush mode, unlocked by getting the best ending. You select a completed file, and a level 40 Soma uses the file's loadout, and a fixed set of consumables. You can play as Julius by selecting a completed Julius Mode file. But again, boss rush mode isn't really my thing. This time, hard mode is unlocked by beating the game with a good ending. Enemies take 20% less damage, and if it's a new game plus, souls that haven't been previously collected are easier to obtain. There's also a no souls mode, where Soma can collect souls but can only use ones required to finish the game, and a no item mode where Soma can't use items. Before we wrap things up, I wanted to mention one other thing. If you're wondering how you can play these old Game Boy Advance games without a GBA or the game carts, and you're not keen on emulating, Konami did release the digital-only Castlevania Advance Collection, which contains, alongside this GBA trilogy, Castlevania Dracula X for the SNES for some reason. That covers the BPCs from the Castlevania trilogy on the GBA. I know there are only 2 real bonus playable characters here, much less than the last one, but I hope you still found it interesting. Julius is fun to play as, and I personally consider Maxim the best of the BPCs. That's not to say there aren't good ones still yet to come. Part 3 will conclude this series by covering the DS trilogy, and there's a lot there to delve into. If you have any other bonus playable characters you'd recommend I check out, let me know. These modes bring a fresh new experience that make revisiting these games a treat. Thanks again for checking this out, and I hope to catch you in the next one.